Okay, so welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing Huntington's disease and Huntington's disease medications. Okay, so in the previous video what we have discussed is the brain structures which are part of the basal ganglia. Now the basal ganglia is a collection of nuclei which are all involved in doing the same function, the function of which we'll see in a moment with regards to the motor system at least. Okay, now let me just remind you of these different structures which are all part of the basal ganglia then. So, we've got both parts of the substantia nigra here, the substantia nigra pars compacta in green, which is the medial portion of the substantia nigra, and then the substantia nigra pars reticulata, which is the lateral part of the substantia nigra, shown here in red. Okay. Then other components of the basal ganglia are the subthalamic nuclei here, okay, which sit, remember, just atop the substantia nigras, in between the top of the substantia nigra and the bottom of the thalamus, hence why they're called the subthalamic nuclei, because they're underneath the thalamus. And then we've got the dorsal striatum, which remember consists of the putamen here in orange and the caudate nucleus here in pink, but not the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is part of the full striatum, but we're talking about the dorsal striatum, and this just means the caudate nucleus and the putamen. Okay, then in addition, you've also got the two components of the globus pallidus, which one of them's not very visible here, but underneath where I've now scribbled the caudate nucleus, you'll now have the external globus pallidus in here in red, and then in blue there, the internal globus pallidus. Right, okay, now, before we finally look at the function then of the basal ganglia, there is one more thing that I want to show you that is very, very anatomy-ish, so I want to get that out of the way now, which is the nigrostriatal projection. Okay, so this is the projection of axons from the substantia nigra pars compacta to the dorsal striatum, and we will see the function of this later when we actually discuss the function of the basal ganglia and the way that they work. Okay, we need to look at this because although it's not as important as it is in Parkinson's disease it's specifically this bit that breaks. Okay, in Huntington's disease the substantia nigra pars compacta isn't going to break, it's going to remain intact. The reason it's very important for us to look at this, however, is because the drugs that are going to help remove the Chorea symptoms, okay, they are all going to work on this substantia nigra pars compacta system. They're going to work on the dopaminergic neurons of the substantia nigra pars compacta. So it's very important that we look at this, okay? Right, so I'll get another piece of paper and then we'll talk more about this dopaminergic projection from the substantia nigra pars compacta to the dorsal striatum. And this is known as the Nigrostriatal Tract, which means it's going to go from the substantia nigra, specifically the substantia nigra pars compacta, to the dorsal striatum here. Okay, right. So, before I actually show you the anatomy of the nigrostriatal tract, I want to give you the motivation for what this actually is. So, the substantia nigra pars compacta is a very special collection of neurons, okay? It contains a bunch of neurons that use a very special neurotransmitter, okay? And that special neurotransmitter is dopamine. Now, dopamine is a very rare neurotransmitter to be used in the brain. The main two neurotransmitters that are used in the brain are glutamate, which is the main excitatory neurotransmitter, and GABA. Okay, and we'll be talking a little bit more about glutamate and GABA later on. Okay, they are the main neurotransmitters of the brain. If you just pull out a neuron at random from the brain, it's likely that its neurotransmitter will be one of these two. Okay, dopamine is very, very rare in the brain. Very few neurons use dopamine, okay? And the neurons which do use dopamine are generally all clustered together in great lumps in nuclei, okay, in certain nuclei. Okay, and one of these nuclei which contains a bunch of dopaminergic neurons is the substantia nigra pars compacta, and of course you have two, the left and the right side. Okay, and the neurons within the substantia nigra pars compacta, they're going to send their axons out of the substantia nigra pars compacta, okay, and to the dorsal striatum, and they're going to be releasing their dopamine the dopamine neurotransmitter in the dorsal striatum, and it's going to have a very important function within the basal ganglia, which we'll see later on. Okay, for now, what I want to firstly show you is the structure of the neurotransmitter dopamine, okay, and then I'll show you the anatomy of the Nigrostriatal Tract. So firstly then, the structure of dopamine. So here is the amino group, hence what's called dopamine, okay. Then after the amino group you've got an ethylene group, which is just 2 methylene groups. So here's one methylene group, here's a second methylene group, which makes overall an ethylene group. And then off the ethylene group, what you're now going to have is a special structure known as a catechol ring. Okay, now a catechol ring is a benzene ring, so I'll draw a benzene ring like so, with 2 alcohol groups coming off it. So here's one alcohol group, and here's another alcohol group. And that then is the finished structure of dopamine. So let me just highlight up this special structure here. So a benzene ring with 2 alcohol groups coming off it like that is known as a catechol ring. Okay, and this is why dopamine is known as a catecholamine, okay, or a catecholamine if you say it quickly. Okay, now noradrenaline and adrenaline they also have catechol rings in, and also an amino group. They actually have incredibly similar structures to dopamine. Slight modifications of this structure is seen here. For noradrenaline, all you do is take this hydrogen off and stick an alcohol group there. For adrenaline, you take noradrenaline, i.e. you've got the alcohol group here, and you also stick a methyl group coming off the amino group. So you take a hydrogen off and put a methyl group there. But those are the only modifications that you make. So they're still structures with a catechol ring in and an amine group, and therefore they're also referred to as catecholamines. Okay, so that's the origin of that name. Okay, right, so that's the neurotransmitter dopamine. We'll be discussing it more later. We'll be discussing the actual synapses that these dopaminergic neurons are going to form in the dorsal striatum, and we'll also be discussing the receptors for dopamine that are on postsynaptic neurons. Okay, but for now, we'll throw it aside for now, and we'll look at the anatomy of this tract of axons that are moving from the substantia nigra pars compacta into the dorsal striatum, which, remember, consists of the putamen and the caudate nucleus. Okay, right. So, we will start off with the midbrain then, so that we can put the substantia nigra pars compacta in. Okay, so here is the midbrain, here is the left cerebral peduncle, and now I'm drawing the right cerebral peduncle. Okay, and that one's reasonably nicely symmetric. Okay, so, then I'll put in the substantia nigra. Okay, now the only portion that we're interested in at the moment is the substantia nigra pars compacta. We will see the function of the substantia nigra pars reticulata. It's completely different. It doesn't have the dopaminergic neurons in. So here are our 2 substantia nigra pars compactas. Okay, right. Now what I'm going to do is put the thalami sitting on top. Okay, so here is the left thalamus sitting on top here, and I've made it a little bit more narrow than it should be because I've got the substantia nigra pars compacta label there, and I don't want to ruin that. Okay, I shouldn't have put that label there. Right, okay, so here are the thalami. It won't really affect the picture that much. So in turquoise, here are the thalami sitting on top of the midbrain. Okay, right, now we want to put in structures that we haven't, well, we want to put in a structure that we haven't previously put on this picture, okay, which is the hypothalamus. So remember, if I go back to my original picture where we're seeing the brainstem from the left-hand side here, the hypothalamus sits in front of the thalami and also in front of the midbrain. Now, from this picture that we're looking at here, you would think that the hypothalamus was one solid lump. Okay, but it is not. It's hollow inside. Okay, so let me show this here now. So basically, here is the left side of the hypothalamus that we've been previously looking at in that picture. Okay, and it's connecting both of the thalami here. This is the right side of the hypothalamus here. But inside, inside, the hypothalamus is hollow. Okay, so going back to the picture that we've seen before, this picture here, Okay, we are just looking at this side when we're seeing it in this picture. Okay, we're looking at the left thalamus here and the left side of the hypothalamus here. Okay, we couldn't see this hole that's in the middle, which is separating the left side of the hypothalamus here from the right side of the hypothalamus here, although there is a connection at the front. Okay, now this is the continuation of the third ventricle. So the third ventricle runs inside of the hypothalamus as well. So this is all third ventricle. Now the hypothalamus therefore makes up the lateral boundary of the third ventricle. It also makes up the floor of the third ventricle. So the hypothalamus, you've also got hypothalamus down below here. Okay, and it's from this floor portion of the hypothalamus, this inferior portion of the hypothalamus, that the pituitary stalk dangles down. The pituitary stalk would be around here, dangling down from here. Okay, the mammillary bodies also dangle down from here and here. Okay, so this is the left mammillary body and this is the right mammillary body. And then you'd have the optic chiasm dangling down from over here. Okay, right, so this is all hypothalamus. I'm going to colour it in rather, in green here. Okay, right, now the next thing that we need to put into this picture then is the globus pallidi and the dorsal striatums. Okay, so I'm going to put this in bilaterally. So we'll start by putting in the lenticular nuclei here, like so. Here's the putamen, and here are the two portions of the globus pallidus. Okay, so this is the putamen in orange. Then we'll have the external globus pallidus here in red, and then the internal globus pallidus here in blue. Okay, and we'll do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so here's the right lenticular nucleus here, here's the putamen, and here are the two portions of the globus pallidus. So we'll have the putamen again in orange. Okay, then we'll have the external globus pallidus in red and the internal globus pallidus in blue. Okay, and then what we need to do is put on the caudate nucleus. So remember, the caudate nucleus comes around like so and then wraps all the way around like so, and we'll colour that in purple. I'll just show it on this side as well. So it's going to be bilaterally symmetric, okay, curving around like so. Okay, so there are our two caudate nuclei, and I think I'll just outline them in vivid purple this time rather than colouring them in. Okay, so there we go, that's the caudate nucleus on the left hand side, and here is the caudate nucleus on the right hand side. The next thing then that we want to show is this nigrostriatal dopamine tract. How are dopaminergic neurons, which have their cell body in the substantia nigra pars compacta, going to get into the dorsal striatum, which remember consists of the putamen and the caudate nucleus here? Okay, well, they go into a structure known as the medial forebrain bundle. Okay, and it's this structure that I want to show now. Okay, so the medial forebrain bundle, you're going to have a left medial forebrain bundle and a right medial forebrain bundle as well. And for short, the medial forebrain bundles are often abbreviated as the MFBs. Okay, right, so let me show this. So we're going to have our dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra pars compacta here. They're then going to go into the medial forebrain bundle, and the medial forebrain bundle, it runs through the hypothalamus here. Okay, and it's on both sides. So on the other side, here is the right substantia nigra pars compacta. It will be sending dopaminergic neurons into the right medial forebrain bundle here, and this is the left medial forebrain bundle. The dopaminergic neurons of the nigrostriatal tract are then going to leave the medial forebrain bundle and go into the dorsal striatum. Now, this blue line then, this is not supposed to represent a single dopaminergic axon. This is supposed to represent a bundle of a huge number of dopaminergic axons. Okay, so you've got loads of dopaminergic neurons in here. They're all sending their axons into the medial forebrain bundles, which are these portions here running through the hypothalamus. The medial forebrain bundle actually goes on, okay, but other fibres are going to go on further through the hypothalamus. The ones of the nigrostriatal tract are going to come out of the medial forebrain bundle early on to move into the dorsal striatum. Okay, so these are the medial forebrain bundles. Okay, right. And then the dopaminergic axons are going to leave the medial forebrain bundle and they're going to go into the dorsal striatum on both sides. So dopaminergic fibers from the left substantia nigra pars compacta are going to go into the left dorsal striatum, and dopaminergic neurons from the right substantia nigra pars compacta are going to go into the right dorsal striatum. Okay, right. So this pathway whereby you have dopaminergic neurons which have their cell bodies in the substantia nigra pars compacta going to the dorsal striatum to deliver dopamine, this is known as the Nigrostriatal Tract. So the entire thing is called the Nigrostriatal Tract. The medial forebrain bundle is just this bundle of axons that's in the hypothalamus, and as I say, there are other neurons that go on further on through the hypothalamus, so the medial forebrain bundle continues on. Okay, if you like, these come out of the medial forebrain bundle early on. Okay, the entire pathway from substantia nigra pars compacta to dorsal striatum is called the Nigrostriatal Tract. Okay, right. So, we will come back to the function of the Nigrostriatal Tract later on. We'll see how important it is for the function of the basal ganglia. Okay, now what we're going to turn our attention to is the actual function of the basal ganglia. Now, firstly, I'm going to give you the big picture of what the basal ganglia actually do, and then we'll look at the different projections which it is believed contribute to this function. Okay, now I need to at this point say something about the philosophy of science, okay, or the nature of science. Science, all science, is just models that help us understand reality. Okay, what I am about to present to you with regards to the function of the basal ganglia is a model of the function of the basal ganglia. Okay, we have no better model. This is the best model we have, but it is laughably simple. Okay, so it's a model that helps us understand reality, and don't think ever that it's more than that. It is just a model. Okay, it contains some truth in it. Okay, it has some truth that parallels the real world. Okay, but don't take this as what the basal ganglia is and that's it. Okay, it is just a model of how the basal ganglia work. Okay, and there's already growing evidence that this model is too simple and needs adapting. Okay, but as yet it is still the best model we have. Right, okay, so now I'm going to talk about how the motor system works then. Okay, so before we discuss the basal ganglia, there are some other portions of the brain that we need to see what their function is in the motor system. Okay, and then we can see how the basal ganglia is going to play a role in this. Okay, right, so I'm going to go back to drawing the left cerebral hemisphere seen from the left-hand side. Okay, and then I'm going to put the central sulcus on here as that landmark that helps us locate different portions of the cerebral cortex. Okay, now I'm going to introduce you to some other portions then of the cerebral cortex. Okay, so the portion of cerebral cortex just in front of the central sulcus, coloured here in red. This is what's known as the primary motor cortex. Okay, and this is going to play a very important role in the motor system. I'll explain what the role of the primary motor cortex is in the motor system in a moment, after I've put on some other portions, because there are other portions that you need to start with before you discuss what the primary motor cortex is going to do. Okay, now, sitting in front of the primary motor cortex, you're going to have secondary motor cortex. And secondary motor cortex is made up of two different portions. The portion that I'm highlighting in green here, and the portion I'm highlighting in blue here. Well, and by the way, I don't think I explained why primary motor cortex was called M1. Okay, I hope it's obvious. M for motor, 1 for primary. Okay, so these two portions in front of the primary motor cortex, these are secondary motor cortex. Together they are the secondary motor cortex. But what are their individual names? Well, the green one here, and this is known as the supplementary motor cortex, or the supplementary motor area. Okay, and for short, the supplementary motor area is usually abbreviated to the SMA. Okay, then the portion that I've highlighted in blue, which is further down, this is known as the premotor cortex. Okay, but together we're going to cluster them together in this video. Okay, we're not going to distinguish between their functions. Okay, we're going to cluster them together as the secondary motor cortex. Okay, right. Then one final portion of the cerebral cortex that we're going to need is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which we've already seen. Okay, we know this is incredibly involved in executive control. Okay, so I'll put that on there in turquoise. That's sitting in front of the secondary motor cortex. Okay, so this is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Alright, so we're now ready to discuss the motor system then. So, this is our model for how the motor system works. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, it starts the whole thing off. It decides that it wants to make a movement, and by the way, this is all voluntary movement that we're talking about now. Okay, so the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex decides that it's going to make a movement. So to give you an example, let's say I want to pick up this pen. Okay, so my dorsolateral prefrontal cortex decides that it wants to pick up the pen. So that's the first step. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is going to make the decision, the executive controller is going to make the decision that it wants to pick up the pen. It is then going to send the command to the secondary motor cortex. Okay, and what does the secondary motor cortex do? Okay, well, the secondary motor cortex is responsible for creating what's known as a motor plan. Okay, now this is a really important concept. Okay, what is a motor plan? Well, let me try and give you the motivation for what this is, because this is an incredibly complicated concept. Okay, if you actually want to make a movement, oops, sorry about that, if you actually want to make a movement, say picking up this pen, you have to contract a huge number of different muscles. Think about all the muscles in the hand, okay, that you're going to have to move, and all the muscles in the forearm as well that you're going to have to move, okay. So there's a huge number of different skeletal muscles that are going to have to contract in order to make that movement, and they're all going to have to contract to exactly the right amount, okay, and also at exactly the right time, you know, because you're going to be moving different muscles at different times, so it's going to have to be incredibly synchronized, basically. Okay, now think about what a nightmare that actually is, because why do the muscles contract? They contract because neurons which innervate them are sending action potentials. Each skeletal muscle fiber has a great number of different axons innervating it, so you need to send this horrendously complicated array of action potentials down a huge number of different neurons, and it all has to be calibrated. You need the correct neurons to be activated at the right time, to the right amount, basically. So it's a huge synchronized array of action potentials being fired down a huge number of different neurons. Okay, what generates that incredible pattern of action potentials? Okay, well, that's the secondary motor cortex, and that incredibly synchronized array of action potentials in both space and time. And what I mean by that is it's synchronized over a huge number of different axons, so all the different axons are firing to the right degree, okay, and it's also synchronized in time, so that the right axons are firing action potentials at the right time to then get the muscles to contract to the right amount at the right time to create the movement. And that incredible pattern of action potentials, that is what is known as a motor plan. Okay, so it's the synchronized pattern of action potentials that are being sent down a huge number of different axons. Now, it's the secondary motor cortex that is believed to be responsible for creating this incredibly synchronized array of action potentials, i.e. the secondary motor cortex comes up with the motor plan. Okay, right, so here you're going to get a motor plan being concocted, and then what's going to happen is the secondary motor cortex is going to send that motor plan to the primary motor cortex. So the motor plan is now going to go to the primary motor cortex, and then the primary motor cortex is effectively just a relay hub. At least simply we can think of it as a relay hub. Okay, the motor plan gets sent to the primary motor cortex, and then the primary motor cortex contains the neurons which are going to send their axons all the way down the brainstem, down the spinal cord, and then they'll synapse on final motor neurons, which will have their cell bodies down in the spinal cord. And then obviously you'll send the action potentials down those final motor neurons, and that will actually cause the movement. Okay, so effectively we can think of the primary motor cortex as just being a relay hub that's going to send action potentials down into the spinal cord. Okay, so if the secondary motor cortex sends its motor plan onto the primary motor cortex, then that motor plan will actually be initiated and you will actually make the movement. Okay, now there's a problem here, which is that the secondary motor cortex is continuously coming up with a huge number of different motor plans, and many of them it was not instructed to come up with by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So we had a motor plan here that was being concocted because the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex had told us to concoct it. Okay, however, other areas of the secondary motor cortex, they'll be coming up with motor plans as well, and these motor plans will not have been instructed to be come up with by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay, the secondary motor cortex just comes up with motor plans all the time, basically. Okay, and a lot of them are therefore garbage. You do not actually want them to be initiated. Okay, and therefore they are not sent to the primary motor cortex, and they are not initiated. Now, how then does the motor plan that we actually want to be initiated get through to the primary motor cortex? What gives this motor plan permission to be moved on to the primary motor cortex? Well, that's what the basal ganglia are going to do, and I'll just put a circle here, which is all the nuclei of the basal ganglia right in the center of the cerebral cortex here. Okay, basically what happens is if this motor plan was actually produced because we received instruction from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, then what will happen is this portion of secondary motor cortex that has created that motor plan will send word to the basal ganglia. Okay, it will say, wait, look at me, I actually have permission to come up with this motor plan. Okay, I have received instruction from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This motor plan is actually supposed to be initiated. Okay, and then the basal ganglia will then send a signal back to that portion of secondary motor cortex saying, okay, we understand, you can have permission to send it through. Okay, so basically the basal ganglia is often compared to a gatekeeper. It controls which motor plans are actually going to be sent from the secondary motor cortex to the primary motor cortex, and by doing that it controls which motor plans are actually going to be initiated. So, if you want a motor plan to be initiated, you need to send word to the basal ganglia, and then the basal ganglia will send you a signal that says, yes, we give you permission to then send this to the primary motor cortex. For all the other portions of secondary motor cortex that are creating motor plans which were not instructed to be created, okay, those are not going to be sending signals to the basal ganglia, and therefore they're not going to be getting the permission. Okay, only those motor plans which actually had instructions from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex for them to be created will send signals to the basal ganglia that actually leads to them going through to the primary motor cortex and therefore being initiated. Okay, right, so the basal ganglia then controls which motor plans that the secondary motor cortex comes up with are actually going to be initiated. Okay, and you can now start to see how things going wrong with the basal ganglia could lead to the symptoms of chorea. In chorea, we are getting motor plans initiated that should never have been initiated. Okay, so if there's problems with the basal ganglia, we can understand why that might occur. Then later on in Huntington's disease, we're getting the hypokinesia, where you just can't initiate voluntary movements easily anymore. Okay, that also could be explained by problems with the basal ganglia, because if you cut off the permissive signal to this motor plan that actually had an instruction, then it's not going to go through to the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex, and therefore it's not going to be initiated. Okay, so often the basal ganglia is said to give the permissive signal for motor plans to actually go through to the primary motor cortex and be initiated. Okay, right, so we will call it there for this video, and in the next video what we'll move on to is a more in detailed study of how this works. We'll look at the different circuits which underlies how this works, and we'll begin by looking at what actually sends the permissive signal to the secondary motor cortex that says, look, this motor plan can now go through to the primary motor cortex, because it's not actually the basal ganglia that does that. It's going to be certain nuclei of the thalamus